If you've ever been behind the camera trying to film something, you know how hard it can be to expose properly. It's bright outside, you can't really see the LCD screen, or your eyes are just playing tricks on you, and then you go home and everything is just whitewashed garbage. It's overexposed or it's underexposed and you just can't see anything. Here's how you can expose properly every single time, no guessing needed. Alright, so we're going to be talking about what you can do while you're filming to expose properly, but then also what you can do in post so that you know that your contrast levels and your saturation and all that stuff is all good. So let's start with while you're filming. There's a few different tools that most cameras these days have that you can use to judge exposure so you don't have to guess all the time. The first thing you can use is a histogram, which has been pretty much every single camera, and it's basically just telling you what exposure values you have. On the left side, you'll have your shadows, the dark spots, and then on the right side, you'll have your highlights, and then everything in between. And basically what it's doing is showing you how much of that exposure value you have in your scene. So for example, if you're hugging the left side, that means you're underexposing. If it's touching the left side, there's spots that you have no detail in the shadows. You're actually losing that. It's called clipping. And then the same thing on the right side. If you're hitting that right side, you're hugging it, that means your highlights are being overexposed and you're losing information. You're clipping your highlights. Now this is a great way to quickly see where your exposure values are. You typically want them right in the middle, kind of like a mountain. That's the most ideal. But the problem is you don't actually know what in your frame is underexposed or overexposed. And let me tell you why that's a problem. For example, if you have a really bright light or a sun in your shot, well then you're gonna have some overexposure. But it might trick you into thinking that your whole image is overexposed and then you'll start underexposing, but really it was just that bright sun, which is always gonna overexpose. You're never gonna be able to expose that because it's just so bright. Now you can be smart about this and look at your frame and say, okay, well there's the sun, it's fine if a little bit is overexposed, but the majority of the values are in the right place, so it's okay. So if you're smart, a histogram can be a great tool, and if you have nothing else, definitely use the histogram. But if you want even more information about your exposure values, you want to use a waveform scope. What a waveform does is it basically shows you your image from left to right, and it shows you where those exposure values are in that image. It's shown on a scale from 0 to 100, so anything below 0 is dark, there's no details there, you're losing it, you're clipping the shadows, and anything above 100, you're overexposing, you're losing the highlight detail, you're clipping the highlight. So let's say you have a really bright spot on the right side of your image, it's the sun or a bright light or whatever it is, you're gonna see that the exposure values go really high in that area. So it's basically mapping out your whole image and showing you where the exposure values are. So if something is really high on the left side, you know that there's something overexposing in that left section of your frame. You don't know exactly what that thing is, but you can kind of guess. For example, you don't know what the exposure of the face is, but you know whereabouts it is. You can probably guess where the exposure for the actual face is in there. But it's not perfect, but it's way better than the histogram. It gives you a lot more information. And again, you want to be kind of in the middle. You don't want anything going above 100 and you don't want anything going below 0. You want to be kind of in the middle right there. But again, there's exceptions. For example, a really bright light, the sun, it's gonna go above the 100 and that's okay. But now you know that it's just the sun and it's okay. You don't need to change your exposure. It's fine if that part is overexposing. I use the waveform all the time if I can, and that's why I love things like the small HD monitors, the 502, that's the one that I use a lot, especially if I'm doing a commercial or something. It might be a camera that I'm not super used to, so if you're just looking at the LCD, you might think that you're overexposing, but you're actually not. But then I can use the waveform on my small HD, no matter what camera it is, I know that I'm exposing properly. Because every camera has a different LCD screen, you can't really just rely on that and judge by your eyes. You need to use something like a waveform. Another really great tool that something like the 502 monitor has is false color. Now when you first see this, you think that someone on drugs just high off their mind is color grading this, and it's just crazy psychedelic. But what false color is, it's basically mapping different exposure values to different colors. So you have this little scale on the bottom. You see that it goes from magenta purple at 0 and then all the way to 100 orange red. And all the different colors signify different exposure values. So here, you know, if anything is purple or magenta, then you're clipping the shadows, you're losing details, you're underexposed. And if anything is orange or red, then you're clipping the highlights and you're losing detail there, you're overexposed. But the beauty of false color is that you know everything on your image where the exposure is, especially with the skin tones. That's the most important thing. You know exactly where the skin tones are. So for example, if the color on the skin tones is yellow, you know you're a little bit too overexposed and you just stop it down to a nice level. Or let's say the skin tones are starting to be a darker blue color on this false color, then you know that you're underexposed and you can change the settings. I love the false color. I used to think it was the stupidest thing ever, but it's so handy for judging exposures. Probably one of the best tools for that. But the question now is, you see what the exposure values are, but how do you know what should be what? How do you know what the skin tone should be at? Should they be at 20 or 30 or 40 or 70 or 80 or 50? Where should they be? And that's where the Ansel Adams zone system comes in. Ansel Adams was a famous black and white photographer, just a brilliant guy. He was just a master at exposure and contrast, and he made this zone system showing from 0 to 10 or 100 and what those different exposure values usually signify. So right away here we can see that a darker skin complexion should be around 40, and then if you have a pale skin person, then they should be around 70. When you pair the false color and the Ansel Adams zone system, you really have the perfect tool to judge where your exposure should be, especially the skin tones, and those are the most important. I highly recommend using false color, especially if you have more time where you're lighting a setup, you have different lights going on. It is the best way to judge your exposure, especially when you're starting out and you don't want to use something like a light meter, which is what they used to use a lot back in the film days. DPs still use them nowadays, but not quite as much. I especially like using false colors for things like the contrast ratio between the dark and light side of the face. It's just really handy, works beautifully. Alright, so those are the scopes that I highly recommend you use while you're shooting, but what can you do in post to make sure your exposure values, your contrast, and your colors are all looking good and that your eyes aren't tricking you? You actually end up using a lot of the same scopes. It's a little bit different though, because when you're filming, you're trying to preserve image and getting the best exposure, whereas in post, you can be a lot more creative with things and there aren't these hard, fast rules necessarily. You don't need to stick to these rules, but in post, you're using scopes to kind of keep yourself consistent, to match one shot to the next. You don't want one clip to look completely different from the next one. You want them to match. And in post, I'm mostly using the waveform for exposure and contrast and the vector scope for colors. So just like when you're filming, you use your waveform to judge your contrast and your exposure values. And typically you would want your shadows to just touch the 0 IRE value. So they're just going to the real black level, but you're not clipping anything. Now again, this is not a hard fast rule. If you want to do a different creative look, for example, kind of a faded look, you can bring them up and not have any values touching the 0, so you're not having any true blacks, and it's going to give this faded look to your image. With the highlights, again, you just want them touching that 100 IRE, but that's only if you have something really bright in your image, for example, the sun or a bright light. But if there's nothing really bright in your image, you don't want to bump it all the way to 100. And again, this is a creative choice that you can make to just drop them a little bit lower and have nothing, even the brightest spots, go to 100. I do this really often. And typically for my looks, I'd like to just touch the 0 IRE, but I don't like to go all the way to 100. It just kind of cuts some of that digital harshness if you keep the highlights at about 90 or even 80 sometimes. It's a really cool look. But again, this is a creative decision. Just make sure that all your clips have the same exposure values. That's the most important thing. And the vector scope is perfect for seeing your colors in a scientific, precise way. And it's basically just a color wheel, and it's showing where on that color wheel your image is shifting towards. So for example, if your image is a little bit too blue, it'll be shifting towards the blue colors. Or let's say your image is too green, it'll shift towards the green values. Typically you want the colors to be around the center. That's when your image is color balanced. Also, you can use the vector scope to judge your saturation levels. So the the closer the levels are to the middle, the less saturation you have, and the further they are towards the outsides, the more saturation you have. So it's perfect for seeing how much saturation is in this clip and then how much is in this clip, and then you can match those two saturation levels. Because even if you have the exact same settings, the lighting, all these different things affect the amount of saturation that's in your image. So this is the only way you can be exact, precise with the amount of saturation between shots. So let's say your image is way too blue, it's shifting towards the blue areas. What can you do? Well, you just take a 3-way color corrector and you drag it to the opposite direction. It's that easy. Or let's say it's too green, you just drag it to the opposite direction, red, boom, easy, there you go, it's fixed. So you go through each shot and you make sure that it's color balanced nice and properly, and then also that the saturation levels match each other. So our eyes and our brain can trick us into seeing colors and exposure values incorrectly, but these scopes are always going to be accurate. They're a scientific way of seeing where your exposure is, where your colors lie. The scopes always tell the truth, and that's why it's so important to use them while you're filming to make sure 100% of the time your exposure is correct, and then in post to make sure that your contrast and exposure and your colors are matching from shot to shot and they're looking good. I highly recommend getting used to the waveform. It'll save you in so many different situations. And then in your post process, use waveform and vector scope. Those are really gonna help you to stay consistent, to stay scientific, and not have your eyes play tricks on you. All right, that was super technical, but I think it's really important. A lot of you guys have been asking how to use scopes properly, so I hope this helps you a little bit. If you like this video, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. I'd love for you to be a part of this community. Guys, enjoy the filmmaking process and go get some of those travel feels.